Hello and welcome to CANNAMAntv. In this interview, I speak with the founder of the Real Seed Company, Angus. In this interview, we discuss the most recent additions to the Real Seed Company website, the importance of preserving authentic landrace cannabis varieties, methods of preservation, the need for greater cannabis biodiversity, the threat of hybridization for traditional cultivars, and the UK and inhibiting factors for cannabis access. Make sure to like and subscribe, and join me on Patreon and PayPal to help to build a stronger media platform. Now then, let's talk cannabis. Before we get fucking cracking on hybridization and biodiversity fucking being reduced and shit like that, what have you been up to anything recently? You got anything new in the website and things like
that? There are definitely some new things on there since we last spoke. Got some things from East India, which we were talking about last time, as an area, and the whole history of sort of sinsemilla and sativas in the sense of narrow leafleted tropical land races. And so I've got a new accession from Orissa, or Odisha is the what that province is called these days, which is just to the south of Bengal. So latitude wise, it's kind of same level as sort of Malaysia and Thailand and things. Those are really interesting to me because based on what there is in the way of history and sort of documentation, it looks like that bit of East India is a real origin point, a very, very plausible, likely origin point for those for sativas and for the sinsemilla technique. It's just, broadly speaking, around there where the Anandakanda was compiled, which is the first text to describe the sinsemilla technique, sort of 12th to 15th century probably.
Right.
So yes, got that accession from there, and then there's got a few more things from Nepal. So the what I call kind of mountain ganja. It's maybe not a great term for it, but it's a particular type of landrace you get around the Kathmandu Valley and a little bit west of there, which is different from the main multi-purpose type. This mountain ganja stuff is more potent and kind of interesting because it's for people who are at more northern latitudes. So if you're working at like 40 degrees north or something, so most of North America, you could grow these Nepalese land races outdoors and they would finish properly, whereas tropical land races, there's not much chance of really getting them to really perform the way they should north of 30 degrees, which basically rules out most of the United States as a place to grow real tropical land races outdoors. Having said which, the Orissa accession is probably like 5 months from seed to harvest, which means it's slightly earlier than a typical tropical landrace, sativa landrace, which tends to be they tend to be more like 6 months from seed to harvest. Anyway, so I've got a few more things on the site basically, and that's just based on the traveling I did between the collecting that me and a couple of friends did between October and March, and a lot of the other stuff that we were collecting was more like weedy wild material, which is really interesting for and much more important for preservation projects, because the weedy stuff is where the kind of crappy, weedy, feral, wild-growing stuff is where all the biodiversity is.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, talk about that then. Why is that the case?
Basically, wild relatives of crops. So, for like other examples, like, corn, its wild relatives, teosinte, I think is the name, or the wild relatives of potatoes, or the wild relatives of wheat. They're really interesting if you're wanting to develop crops with resistance to climate change, diseases, all the things that are going to come with that. And the reason they're more diverse is just that wild growing populations, they haven't had any selection done on them.
Mm-hmm.
So what you do when you're selecting for the traits you want, you're narrowing down the population. You're narrowing down the gene pool basically in the process of selecting for, even if it's not a conscious, of course, for the vast majority of human history, it's not been a conscious process of doing that, but even unconscious selection for traits you're looking for. So if you want something really, really potent, if you want something that smells a particular way or whatever, you're gonna be narrowing down the gene pool in the process of looking for those traits.
Yeah.
And so colloquially speaking, they talk about stepping on the genome being what happens when you select. So in land races, so just for anyone who's listening who might not be aware, land races are a very misleading sounding term in English. If you actually were to translate the German Landrace into English, literally, it would be country breed. That would be how it translates. So it's an old sense of race. So land races are domesticated. They're creations of humans, and in real landrace populations. So not modern stuff. Even Afghani number one, for example, some people will call that a landrace, which you can buy from like Sensi Seeds or whatever. That's not a landrace. That's been in the West for 40, 50 years now. Mm-hmm. And it's been selected in a Western way. So when I talk land races, I mean real land races, like you will find an actual Afghan farmer growing or an actual Lao farmer growing in these places. Within those populations, the really narrow, really heavily selected populations are the really strong ones. So the tropical sativas are much more potent than the real Afghan hash plants, right? So the southern, you've got the two populations, colloquially we call them the sativas and the indicas. The indicas are up in the north in the Hindu Kush and those kind of places. Sativas are down in the tropics. Sativas are more potent because they've had individual plant selection done on them. Real Afghan hash plants in the Hindu Kush have only had bulk selection done on them. So the bulk selection just means that you're only you're pooling all the seeds in the process of making the hash. So you haven't got that kind of intensive pressure that you have in a culture which is growing sinsemilla,
Mm-hmm.
or so of course it's not literally sinsemilla, because now and then there will be a seed or two in a batch of tropical landrace bud that you might buy, and Thai stick or whatever, or in Orissa or somewhere. But what happens in a bud growing culture as opposed to a hash culture is that if you have a really outstanding batch of bud, you can keep the seeds from it, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you imagine you expand. If you imagine each season, so if you could have like 500 years worth of individual selection going on with tropical land races at least, That's why back in the 60s, even if you got a really good batch of Thai stick, it would be like, getting close to around the 20% THC, insofar as those types of figures are meaningful. Like that's based on British customs seizure analysis back in the early 70s.
Right.
Without them trying to sort of tweak the THC levels, they were saying, oh, this is about 17% THC based on our chromatography analysis of it, So they weren't cutting off they weren't trimming off all the leaves to kind of skew the results like you would get if you sent your bud to a test in the States these days. They weren't trying to prove anything. And so 17% THC back in the early 70s, that's what you get if in a culture like in Thailand or Laos, where people would keep the seed they know to keep the seeds from a really good batch of weed and use it the next time they're growing in their garden or whatever,
Mm-hmm.
So that process of selecting for potency, that's going to narrow down the gene pool loads. Whereas in a hash culture like in Afghanistan, you just basically don't have that. If you look at the cannabinoid, the genes that code for THC and CBD and stuff in the Afghan land races, you can see that it's the population is skewed a little bit towards the what we call type 1 plants. So you've got the population leans a bit towards the THC dominant plants, which means that that there has been over sort of 5,000 years, there has been selection going on for THC, but it's been at a bulk level because more or less all the time people have been pulling the seeds,
Mm-hmm.
at the end. So you just don't have that intensive pressure for that. Whereas in the tropical sativas, tropical land races, you've got most of the time you have a population that's almost entirely just THC dominant, so almost entirely just type 1. And whereas in a Hindu Kush population, you've got type 1, type 2, and type 3. So you've got THC dominant, you've got balanced THC and CBD, and you've got CBD plants, individuals, So basically, if you were to grow a real hash landrace from Afghanistan, straight from Afghanistan, if you wanted to be using that for bud, you'd have to hope you're really lucky and you find a sort of like strong high THC individuals.
Yeah.
That's the work that was being done in the 70s by people like Mel Frank and stuff. They'd get some seeds from Afghanistan and then they'd grow the plants out, give the bud to their mates, and their mates would say, "Oh, this one was really good." So next season they would use the seeds from that, grow the next season's crop from that, and then over 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years, you end up with things like Afghani #1, which is like a THC dominant Afghan hash plant.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So you're doing work that just doesn't more or less happen in a true hash culture.
It's funny that because it's one of the things that you see on one of your posts on Instagram was that it was like not a disagreement, well, probably a disagreement, yeah, not an argument, but disagreement at the minimum was of like people saying that there is no difference between sativa and indica. There is not that, there's not a difference. It's just the same dynamic essentially. And it's the thing where it's like preserving like authentic land races. I think the question, like playing devil's advocate in that situation, like what is it that we're preserving? If there's no any phytochemical difference, because you see that a lot in the medical community a lot of the time when they're like, nah, sativa and indica doesn't represent what it is that you're ingesting. So I mean, for that kind of situation, it's like, what's the importance behind preserving the authentic land races if possible?
Well, the first thing to get clear on, right, is that people can be talking at cross purposes in these kind of conversations, right?
Right.
Because the trouble is that there's many things that make talking about cannabis really difficult from my perspective. Even having a conversation with an expert, who might be like a university teacher, professor of genomics.
Mm-hmm.
I've had conversations with some folks, who are highly qualified in terms of their understanding of the science, but they just don't know the plants. They have no experience of the real plants, right? Everything they're saying, when someone's saying, "Oh, there's no such thing as sativa and indica,"
Mm-hmm.
they're talking about what you have if you go to a dispensary in the States, right? Or if you go to anyone's grow room in the States. 99% of people are growing modern
Hybrid.
Dutch American hybrid genetics. So
Mm.
yeah, it's not wrong to say in that context there's no such thing as sativa and indica because they've been hybridized,
Yeah,
which has
endlessly.
obliterated all the differences between them, right?
Yeah.
And then so it's like having a conversation about food with someone whose knowledge of food begins and ends with hamburgers,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I mean I've had people who are genomics experts in genetics, and they've sort of said to me, "Oh, I think that the Ernest Small and John McPartland study about landraces where they proposed a new taxonomic key was just nonsense. And I couldn't believe it. I said, what do you mean? And then I realized, oh, it's because they just don't have any, they just have never actually grown any real land races or wild material from Asia, you know?
Mm.
So they just thought it was just a load of old piffle. And it took me a while to understand that that's what why they were not, why they saw it differently from me. I thought, fucking hell, they just got some really advanced level understanding of the DNA or whatever. And actually, it's no, they just don't fucking know the plants, you know?
Yeah.
And they also don't have the knowledge of the traditional cultures. So, you know, I found myself explaining, and I was doing quite a bad job of it, but the difference between a population that's been developed by selection of individual plants versus a population that's been developed by selection of at a bulk level where every single plant in the field gets mixed up at the end in the hash making process, and you mix all the seeds up. You know,
Mm.
When you're dry sieving hash in Afghanistan, they will just take every single plant from the field, dry it all out, shred it all up, take all the seeds out, put the seeds into a big onto a big load of sacking in the sun, and dry the seeds out so they don't go moldy in storage. But there's no individual plant selection there, you know. Anyway, so you know, but these kind of details that, like, I just took them as read that people would know that kind of thing, because it just, you know, I hadn't been thinking about how it's the curse of knowledge, you know. You tend not to I tend to just assume that people would know that, you know.
Yeah.
But often people aren't factoring that into when they're thinking about it, even when they're highly qualified experts on cannabis.
I think one of the things there was I think it was a Business Insider article that kind of went into that kind of shit that was on your Instagram, and it was highlighting the essentially the absence of what you're describing. You know, there wasn't any traditional value applied. It was more from a scientific lens based in the genomic construct, the fucking phytochemical profile, that kind of stuff. There wasn't really any traditional perspective. And is that your central focus, do you think? Is it just like maintain the traditional values of what once was before it's completely gone?
No, I mean, look, I mean, the problem, you know, earlier on I was talking about other crops like potatoes or whatever, you know.
Yeah,
It
yeah.
sounds like a bit random to start banging on about potatoes. They're a huge, what has happened with a lot of them is that people have started scrabbling to deal with the problems you get when the gene pool gets incredibly fucking narrow
Mhm.
far too late, you know. So you know, these huge kind of blights and infections just wiping out potato crops and banana crops and all kinds of stuff in various bits of the world. And at the last minute, everyone's going, oh fucking hell, we need to have all these wild relatives, crop wild relatives they call them, so that we can actually breed some varieties that are actually resistant to all this stuff.
Right.
If you do that too late, you're fucked, you know.
Yeah.
So what I'm doing is not like some kind of nostalgic thing. No, I mean, like or some desire to kind of preach about traditional culture to people. That was just, for me, that's in like the culture is interesting in its own right, and I think it's good for people to know about it, but you don't have to know about that. But much more important is that they're actually decent collections of the wild relatives and the land races of cannabis, so that you have that breadth of diversity in order to be able to, number one, just on a, you know, when some big crisis comes along that wipes out all of the Dutch American hybrid stuff, there's actually some things we have some stuff in storage that we can use to breed varieties that can resist it and can resist drought, and also just you have a much wider palette of different things to create a much more diverse menu of different effects, different aromas.
Yeah.
You know, people.
That there's actually, but that's where I kind of like I stand in that position. That really like that's my like central focus. Whereas like the phytochemical preservation is crucial for recreational experience, but also for the fact that it's like there could be like phytochemical profiles which are like 100% efficacious towards medical situations but aren't present yet, and we're as you mentioned, we're narrowing it down. And I think that's one of the things that I find most exciting about it is that there could be things that, I mean, there could be like obviously we're still in the analysis of like identifying what cannabinoids are which and blah blah blah, but there could be things that we've not even discovered yet, you know. That
Oh,
are hidden
absolutely.
in these places, you know.
Not could be, definitely 100% are. They're
Right.
there. It's all, you know, and the irony is that well, for someone like me, sort of who's got a foot in the, making a living out of this, ironically, the really kind of crappy, shitty looking weedy plants that you might see growing even next to a road in, the Punjab or something, it's probably going to be in things like that, so something that if you put it on Instagram would get like a couple of likes,
Yeah, exactly. No, I fucking
and
hate that. Pisses me off, man. But if you were to put a fucking bikini on it, there we go. I'll be all right.
yeah, then it would be, oh yeah.
Fucking
But
right, man.
as it is, it's yeah.
Ridiculous, man. But that's exactly that, and I think that's one of the things. It's also when I was reading over your Instagram was one of the things that kind of popped quite explicitly was the conversation about it doesn't matter if we're holding on to these things. We can replicate these plants indoors regardless. You know, it doesn't matter if it's like, as you mentioned at the beginning of the conversation, you know, it's like tropical plants won't be sustainable over in America or wherever they're growing it and all that kind of thing. But obviously you've got cultivators that are, no, we can do this. We can replicate the same environmental circumstance in order to get maximize it. And it's just not the case. You just can't do that in an artificial environment.
Yeah, I mean it is uh the case that you the terroir would be the pretentious sort of way to put it. The land, the climate, the techniques, the culture even can be factored into terroir. Like if you want a really broad way of thinking about it, is very difficult to replicate. And that real tropical sun, for example, which is what you need to really get a true tropical ganja landrace to perform. It needs that intense fucking battering of UV and reflecting back up off the sand, even was how they used to do it in Thailand and Laos back in the heyday of Thai stick. They grow on sandbanks on the Mekong. So you've got like it's all all the lights reflecting back up off the land as well, in March or whatever. And to get that even with modern lighting, you can't really do it. And this also just they don't like being in pots, particularly these kind of plants. Of course, you could breed if you had the material, you could eventually do a very with a breeding project, and it's been done, up to a point with things like, White Widow or Cinderella 99, whatever. You can bring the phytochemical profile of a tropical sativa to some extent into the kind of plant you can grow indoors, but it still isn't quite the same. Maybe at some point it will be possible to do that, but people like Sam Skunkman, that if you talk to them, they'll all say, yeah, the best product you can have is outdoors grown resin hash made from outdoor grown sativas, but they would say, even though they're not, sativas aren't for making hash traditionally, but a haze or whatever grown out in the tropical sun, if you can make dry sieved hash from that, not water hash, because you lose so much of the phytochemicals to the water. Just dry sieved traditional way hash from an outdoor grown tropical plant. Anyway, I've digressed a lot. I've had so much coffee to keep
Not at all,
myself
man. Thing is, as well, like I was just for
functional.
the listeners out there as well, man. I'm so undereducated on this subject; it's embarrassing. So I'm really cautious about what the things I'm even asking and the stuff I'm saying. So I mean, like for your side, Angus, like what is it that you're like? That is the urgency. I'm aware, obviously, it's like preserving the genetics. But at this moment in time, like if somebody was completely absent of anything to do with this conversation, how would you introduce them and be like, "Look, this is what we should begin talking about"?
I mean, the thing is, I mean, it's. I mean, the urgency is preserving the genetics. It would be really good if more people realized that hybridizing everything goes in the opposite direction to that. A lot of people, I think most people don't really appreciate that. It's not just. I mean, the thing is, not everyone needs to be sort of involved in doing this, but it is really good, I think, for people to be aware that the most exciting thing you can do long term, if you're someone who's into cultivating and just enjoys doing the some breeding for your own sort of entertainment, even if you're working with small populations of plants, it is still really good to keep things in their pristine form, to have your own versions of some Thai or some Afghan or whatever, and to have those in your collection, because you'll be surprised, you know, like the industry is still not, needless to say, 100% above board. Seed banks will disappear. People's seed collections will get busted along with their grows. There's so many, so much of what we even had 10, 20 years ago has vanished because of that, you know. I mean, Seedsman, for example, had a great collection of material just based on having been working with African seeds and people, you know, like was a guy based out in South Africa who went around most of sub-Saharan Africa. You know, you had Zambian, Malawi, Swazi, Durban poison. That doesn't exist anymore, you know. And Seedsman had big bags of all of that stuff, big, you know, half-kilo bags of seeds of that. He got someone thieved it all, broke into his place, nicked it all, and it's all gone. And I don't know anyone who's got pure Durban poison anymore, you know. There might be a handful of people, maybe a couple of people listening to this might, but it's gone in South Africa. And that would be a fucking interesting gene pool, because it's, you know, down on the tip of Africa. So you had boats coming from Asia, you had boats coming from all over the place, stopping off there. You know, the crew, the Lascar crew, I'm talking, you know, for several hundred years would have been smoking ganja from various different places. They might have even had seeds to eat and things with them. So Durban poison was a gene pool based on a lot of different places, you know, all hybridizing together there. And yeah, it's all gone, you know, and it's basically extinct, you know.
Right. I mean, like,
Durban poison is a brand name for South African cannabis, but basically, you know, pristine South African cannabis land races just don't exist anymore.
Yeah.
It got eradicated, and then it was, you know, South Africa, pretty cosmopolitan place, it's very connected. It was one of the early places to import fuckloads of Dutch and American seeds, and yeah, it just got hybridized out of existence. Yeah.
Again, one of the things that popped up on your feed was that there was a conversation about people saying that hybridization had the opposite effect of homogenization, you know, and it's like, I mean, could you talk about that? It's like,
shit. I wouldn't pay too much. The thing is, sorry, I talked over you, man. Yes.
That's all right. That's all right. I mean, fucking hell, man. I'm wanting to hear you. Hey, fuck all, contribute, etc. Instigate.
No. It's not saying that. You don't say it. Actually, you know, I'm happy that you're playing the devil's advocate, because it makes it more interesting. Because instead of me just banging on and then you going, right, I agree, or right, I don't know. It's much more interesting if you do present
opposing arguments.
Alternative. Yeah. But I mean, the thing I would say is that, generally speaking, I don't like using social media. The fact I'm on there, like I wouldn't have an Instagram account if I didn't do what I do, you know. I wouldn't be. I'm not on Facebook. I'm not on Twitter. I was on Twitter for a bit, but I don't like using it. It puts me in a bad mood, generally speaking. So if the mere fact of being on there, and then when someone puts on there what I regard as a fucking ridiculous opinion, I'm not. When I answer people's emails, I really make a point of trying to be polite, and even doing that, I see people on forums saying, "Oh God, that guy's arrogant and rude." You know, I'm just trying to write as quickly as I can, like what I regard as a decent reply to what they've asked me. But they'll think I'm being really sort of you know, what's the word, like kind of terse with them and dismissive, you know.
Yeah.
But or some people, you know. But anyway, on Instagram, like you know, generally once I've got into the point where I'm basically having an argument with someone, I'll switch the comments off. I'd switched one of the argument ones back on recently, but you may have been reading that because I wanted to reread what he'd said before we had this conversation, and I might have, I think, forgotten to switch the comments off again.
Yeah.
Still staying on there, but no, it's just people.
Because to be honest, the reason why I was saying that was because in my mind, that's the opposite effect that hybridization has. Like, that's like, of course it makes it that it's like there's you know what I mean?
Yeah, it's not. I mean, yeah, it's you know, a little knowledge is a dangerous thing. I'm probably as much guilty as that of anyone. I'm not a botanist. You know, I wanted to study biology at university, and at the last minute realized that actually I had to do a fuck of a lot of work, and I just thought I'd just bullshit my way through an arts degree, you know, English literature degree, you know. But I'd always wanted to do science. That's what I'd studied right up until I went to uni, you know. But I didn't do that in the end. So, you know, I'm insofar as I've got expert knowledge, it's based on sort of field experience, you know. But even then, I'm not like, what I'm interested in is what the plants are for. I'm not like interested in the difference between a stamen and a pistil and a whatever, you know. To me, it's fucking pretty boring, you know. But when when a lot of these characters that you might see on social media are having kind of very strong opinions about things, or controversial kind of opinions that go against the grain, it's just best to just look in some authoritative work about it by someone who's been a crop scientist for 60 years, like Ernest Small or someone, who literally is the taxonomist who all the legislations, his work is based on all of it. And a guy who criticizes his own work, as well, so he would say, like, yeah, they've based all this legislation in Canada and the EU, and they're using it in the States now. If you go on the Department of Agriculture websites and look about cannabis, you'll see they use his subspecies classification now, and all the work being done on it on the genetic level shows that his subspecies idea, that there's basically it's the hemp subspecies and the marijuana quotes subspecies, the fiber and subspecies versus the drug subspecies. They're using that now. Anyway, suffice to say, so his work is authoritative, it's pragmatic, it's practical. If someone's on social media is like vehemently disagreeing with him, it's not to say they're definitely wrong, but it's a pretty safe assumption that they probably are, and it's people say, oh, you should, that's an ad hominem I can't speak properly. So my brain's so mangled, but it's it's an ad hominem argument. People will say, or say that as if that's a bad thing. It's not. He's an expert, so it's fine to have an ad hominem argument. Do you want a brain surgeon to operate on your brain, or do you want me to operate on your brain? Brain surgeon, because they know what they're talking about. It's why. Anyway, yeah. But we shouldn't have blind faith in experts, but it's good to be critical of everything. But I think in the case of obscure arguments about the taxonomy or classification of cannabis, it's safe to assume that guy who's been awarded by the Taxonomy Society for his work on cannabis is probably safe to
listen to. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And I think, again, to put as a devil's advocate, Angus, people will say it's natural. It's the natural fucking human process when it comes to anything, really, that things evolve over time. So they'll say hybridization, the elimination of these like authentic land races is the natural process of life. What would be the response?
That just sounds fucking nihilistic to me. I mean, the thing is, I understand, okay, like some people read what I write and get slightly the wrong end of the stick, and I do try to sort of be clear in what I'm saying. But if I say to you, like, walking across a 6-lane motorway with your eyes closed is a bad idea and will end in you being hit by a car, I'm not telling you not to do it. If you want to do that, you can do it.
Yeah.
But the end result will be that if we do that, we will eventually get in an accident. So if I'm saying like, please don't bring seed of hybrids to Asia, to Pakistan or Afghanistan, I'm not saying to people you can't do it. I'm not telling people what they can or can't do. In fact, I spent half my life in places like that, and I have a very acute sense, despite being lucky myself, having grown up in the West, in an affluent country, in a middle class family. Most of my friends from Asia are not well off. They live. They're people who, my ex, her family nearly starved to death in the 80s, literally. When they collectivized the agriculture in her country under the communists. They were stuck at home while their parents went out to search for food, and this is when they're kids, and most people in a lot of those countries have chronic malnutrition from just having grown up with the inadequate diet. So I don't fucking need anyone to tell me. I haven't been through it myself, but no one needs to preach to me about how it makes sense for people to use hybrid seeds when they can get more money for the crop. On the other hand, it is irresponsible as someone who knows the consequences of that and who likes cannabis to bring those things to those countries, knowing that what the consequences are for the species when it's not had when we don't have adequate collections in long-term storage. you're making an executive decision by doing that on behalf of everyone between now and whenever the world blows up. You know, everyone from now until the end of time is gonna, you're deciding what they get to you're choosing for people in the future who have no part in that, in the decision. You know, if you're wiping out that, so I keep saying you one, I don't know what the word's best word. We are making a decision if we should take seeds to these places. That is wiping out all that biodiversity. That's all that is pure potential in those populations, those weedy and landrace populations. That's just pure potential futures. That's just like a multitude of different things, like we were saying already. So that's all those possible avenues, possible cures, possible super strains, blissful experiences, the experiential side, the medical side. You're just narrowing it down, you know, by taking hybrids there. And I'm not alone. It's not a controversial opinion these days that a lot of the modern stuff experientially is not very nice. A lot of it, you know. I was listening to Jason on Curious About Cannabis interviewing, I might get his name wrong, Reggie Galdino or someone, works at Steep Hill Labs, and he was describing he'd grown out Congolese or Congo, sort of one of the land races that's kind of, it's more like an heirloom, if you wanted to use it. These terms are all very, heirloom's a very loose term, but it's not a pure land race in the sense it's been worked in the West, but he grew that out, and he was talking about the experience of smoking it just being so radically different from what that he's used to and his friends are used to in the States. And it's just really a pleasant, nice, strong but pleasant experience. And that the reason is that there's that difference is what happens when that difference between the traditional style high and the more modern stuff. The main thing that accounts for that, in the way he understands it, is simply that in the modern stuff, you've just been selecting for THC, 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 right? And what that's doing is what's being forced out of the resin, so to speak, you know, excluded by that process, is all the different other phytochemicals, like you're saying, you know, all these interesting things that we don't know what half of them even are yet, you know. There's probably like there'll be several thousand of them in different phytochemicals in the resin profile. And all of that is being lost at the expense of just having loads of THC. And the entourage effect, whatever these fancy jargon terms are that people use to describe how the THC interacts with all those different things, you know, other cannabinoids like THCV and all these different aromatic, nice smelling things like, you know, not just limonene, but all that other kind of stuff. As that's all being pushed out, it's pretty, I think it's the fair consensus that you know, you're losing that experiential thing that actually most people I think are looking for when they want to feel good, you know. They want to feel like grubby and grubby and a bit depressed, you know, which is what you get from so much of the new stuff by comparison, you know.
Yeah, no, I feel I agree. And the thing is, because one of the things that's most apparent, like locally, is just a fucking overwhelming amount of Stardog and shit like that, and it's just it's just nothing but commercially fucking produced, and it's the same thing, and they'll be like, oh, it's Stardog this, or it's dog, and it's this. It's the same fucking thing, you know what I mean? And it's just because it's been mass produced, bulk fucking contained, and then punted around the country, and that's what's going on. And it's funny, and then in comparison to that, there's somebody in Scotland who gave me a beautiful bit of cannabis, and he told me, I fucking forget what it is now, but he told me what the general background of what it was and how he came across and all that kind of thing. And it was this, he referred to it as like a ceilingless high, where I consumed it. And as the day went on, I got fucking higher and higher from the same joint. And it was a really a bizarre and a positive sense experience in comparison to this fucking fast food approach cannabis that I'd consumed that's relatively fucking popular all the time, just the only thing that's local. You know, and it's just that comparison. It was like I was dealing with something exotic, like connoisseur level of that. I mean, I was so when I'd finished. I mean, I had it was everybody listening has probably had that kind of experience where there was such a small amount left. I saved the last of it for a special occasion. It was that, you know, and but it's just
Yeah,
the comparison was there wasn't really a comparison. It was just one was fucking unique and the other was generic. And I think that's what potentially what we could be touching on with the basis of the conversation is that that's where we're going. It's just going to be all generic, and there might be slight variation, give or take, but largely speaking, you know, it's essentially the same product with a different name or two or three different phytochemical differences. And I think that's where the threat it feels to me is because I'd never experienced that before. You know, that kind of high where you can see
yeah,
something like as the day goes on, you're like, what the fuck, this is still present, you know, and then it will go down a bit, and before you know it, you'll be active doing something, and it arrives back again. You're like, what the fuck have I consumed this morning? You know.
yeah. And it's it really surprises people who like what you're describing to me now is something I've encountered by bringing things that you know I and friends of mine have grown or bringing landrace stuff to the UK, you know, bringing some nice Thai or nice Nepalese, whatever, to the UK, and then sitting with people who, you know, who have plenty of experience smoking. And, you know, I remember like a mate of mine here grew something called 303, which is based on like as in the kit you use for techno or whatever, you know, but the
Hmm.
name, but because of that sort of, you know, that's that thing you can crank up that does that peak sort of thing on a trance track or whatever, you know.
Hmm.
It's describing that really badly, but that's what it's named after. But it's Papua New Guinean. It's based on a Papua New Guinean landrace, uh, and yeah, I remember just like he'd made some bubble hash from this, and then round a friend's house giving it a different friend's house giving them some, and they're like, "What have you done to me? You know, what have you done to me?" And it is
I got
like,
work tomorrow. Fuck's sake.
yeah, and it is like you're in the early stages of a trip, you know, like
Yeah.
the effect of it, like real vivid color enhancement type effects, you know, and it is weed. It's not like it's been spiked with some
Yeah.
DMT or whatever, but
Hmm.
you're really feeling like in a really altered state and an enhanced state as opposed to a sort of diminished and couch locky state, you know.
Yeah. Even just you
And
talking about that, it's bringing back the memory of that, Angus, where I was like, because one of the
mm,
things that I found was most, that's why I say the connoisseur level of material that I was consuming was like, it was such a compliment the way it was balanced. So I felt this euphoric high, it felt very stimulant
mm,
sensation. I could do a lot of stuff, but it was completely absent of any form of anxiety, any form of nervousness,
nice.
jitteriness, completely absent
Yeah,
of. And that's one of the things that I've noticed with the commercial stuff that's mass produced and it's available locally through everybody is that it's always accompanied with some form of anxiety thing that you've kind of got to
yeah,
endure to then get to something nice. And that's what I'm fucking sick of. It's like you consume it and you're like,
yeah.
first 15, 20 minutes might have that palpitation, fucking raciness, but then it'll mellow into something nice. And that might be like a representation of this like non-synergistic fucking profile as a consequence of it being hybrid over and over and over, you know?
I think it's a bunch of different things, but if someone say to me what are the factors that account for the sort of downer, dysphoric, negative effects of modern stuff, particularly what you might find in the UK, where a fair amount of it is being produced by people who have no love of the plant. They're just doing it in these, you know, Vietnamese gang human trafficking
Yeah,
houses where they just stick some kid in the room to take care of the plants until they pay off the mortgage on the house, whatever it is, you know, that whole scam.
yeah, yeah,
But I think there's just the sort of bad karma type element of it that's attached to the product having been produced in such a negative context. Um, which it can be a subjective thing, you know, kind of placebo effect that just by being even subconsciously aware of that, you know, because with cannabis, it's so much about your subjective state anyway. In addition to you can have the same batch of weed and you smoke it on a bad day and you might have a bad experience.
yeah, yeah,
You know what I mean? There is a huge element of subjectivity, but there's also I think what's going on with a lot of the modern hybrid stuff, particularly that you'd find in the UK. Now, all the different names it has, you know, uh, from conceal the fact that I think a lot of what's being grown is fairly similar. A lot of what, even in terms of its original name when it was bought from the seed bank, all of it is some kind of Hindu Kush skunk, would be what it used to be sold as on the old catalogs. And that's from talking to people like Seedsman, you know, who's saying like, yeah, that's probably the main thing that we sell that gets used for commercial production, he reckoned. You know, I mean, how can he tell? But just that's what he would guess looking at how his stuff sells, you know. It's the Hindu Kush skunk things because it's a good yielder, it's very easy to grow, and it has that smell that I smell everywhere when I'm walking around outside. It smells a bit like a kind of Martian urinal, you know. It's that sort of funky, sweaty, shitty smelling weed, you know, that if you're walking around the streets and you smell someone smoking, where I am anyway, it's got that definite kind of skunk in Afghani skunk, you know, cheese and all those sorts of names. It's in the UK. It's almost all either Afghan skunk cross Afghan or skunk cross Hindu Kush, whatever the. Anyway, you get the idea. So the reason I think that those have a dysphoric effect often is that the indica side of it, of the cross, as opposed to the skunk side, so to speak, the Afghani or Hindu Kush side, those plants were, you know, all this material comes from like Skunkman Sam and Mel Frank. You know, it's the stuff they brought to Holland in the early 80s, right? It's a handful of guys, you know, who this is what people don't appreciate this, you know. It's yes, there was a little bit of work done independently in Holland, independent of these characters, these handful of American characters who came over to Holland in the mid-80s. So, you know, there are lines like Friesland and the Super Sativa seed catalog, whatever they're called, produced that did some original work. But nearly everything people are growing is from a handful of strains that were brought over by David Watson, Sam Selezny, whatever his name. And you listen to him or read him rather, or you listen to him if you go to Amsterdam and meet him, talking about the work he did. He says himself, he didn't used to necessarily even bother smoking his Afghani #1 line when he was maintaining it, because he didn't like to smoke it. He would just select it for resin production, yield, early flowering time, you know? What he actually liked to smoke himself was his haze stuff, you know? Didn't even like to particularly smoke the skunk, you know? It's the hazes that he really liked. That's the real sativa, the type of high that you've been just raving about, you know? And that's the really classy cannabis. That's the good stuff. And that's this goes back to what we were talking about before. This is the stuff that has a long centuries-long pedigree of being selected to be consumed as bud, you know. Whereas Afghani #1 that's not got a history more than a couple of decades of being used to make sinsemilla, you know, used to make bud. You know, these are plants for producing hash, and I think a lot of the dysphoric kind of nasty effects are primarily coming from that side of the hybrid. And like I say, Skunkman Sam said, you know, he's on record saying, yeah, I didn't even bother to fucking smoke my Afghani #1 when I was making more seeds. Just fucking selected it for yield and resin, you know.
Yeah. It's actually interesting. Sorry to interrupt, Angus.
No, do interrupt me because I'll just keep going around in circles because I'm a bit fucking scattered.
That's all right. Essentially, because that's one of the other consequences of the selective process, I suppose. The consequence of that whole inevitably concentrates are going to be affected as well. So it's not just specific flower. It's like you're going to have all this, you know, hash and all the other new technologies of fucking what is it they're even doing now? It's like the wax and the shatter and all these different other things. You know, it's like it's like a knock-on effect. It's a domino effect. So even though at the moment it's like it seems to be central on preserving flower, that has a huge ripple effect on the products which are available right around that plant itself, you know. And I think that's also important because I think as I've said before, like my preference when it comes to anything, obviously it's always good to have flour. My preference is hash. You know, I love hash, and I think it's largely because I've got kind of like almost like a sentimental connection to hash, because when I was like 13, 14 and first stumbled across cannabis, it was through hash first, so that's probably there immediately. But then when I started looking into it, I was like, well, how the fuck did they make this thing? And it was all the original videos, like YouTube when I was into 2004, 2005. YouTube was like raw. You could fucking find tons of shit hot videos. They didn't have the same search blocks and stuff like that they have now. And you'd be able to see. I mean, you can still see a lot of them now. Like how they make them traditionally, and you know, and you've got the fucking the houses in Morocco and these kind of places, and they've got the big massive fucking sheets and beating fuck out with sticks and stuff like that. But when I was like 13, 14, looking at this stuff, this was like you're looking at history, you know, you're engaged in history, and it just has that sentimental connection. Just for myself, speaking personally, but I think that's what, because of hash, that's what it's kind of like. Let's like preserve the traditional methods, just even take away the potential that these phytochemicals can have medically, recreationally, as we've said. There's something that seems to be central, and it might even just be because of the human experience that when it comes to meaning, and I think it might even be that I'm feeling, because it's like there is meaning with tradition. There is something deeper than just a process. There's an insight into human experience, and on the surface it looks like, oh, it's just a fucking hash. You can make a different hash, but it's like, no, if you get rid of the traditional methods of how this hash is made, you also get rid of the kind of connoisseur level product that you're going to make, but you're almost deleting the fucking shit that led to where you're at now. You know, and I think that's something that's, for myself, that's where it's the importance lives, because it's like, this is fucking, it's more than just a product we're consuming. We're engaged in a process which is fucking centuries or thousands of fucking years old.
Yeah, I think in the case of dry sieved hash, it's probably more than 1,000 years old.
Mhm.
The dry sieving filtering method of putting it through
Yeah.
styles. That it that there's descriptions of that in places like Baghdad, of refining other herbs through fabrics, you know, to in the same idea, you know,
Right.
get the resin glands off other plants. Not specific, so there isn't a specific description of doing that for cannabis, but it's reasonable to sort of, yes, like 850 CE or something. There are like alchemist, sort of herbalist type characters who described that process. And excuse me, and in that period, the Baghdad was the sort of center of the Islamic world, you know, by the the sort of end of the first millennium. So they were importing silk from Canton, you know, what would be the city's name now? You know, Guangzhou or somewhere like it, you know, Hong Kong type area of China, southern China.
Mm-hmm.
And they were importing silk by sea by that point. You know, it wasn't coming overland primarily. So, you know, we're really globalized already, you know, and it was probably that innovation, that technique of refining plants in that way probably was likely to be something learned from the Chinese, you know.
Mm-hmm.
Not to say that the Han Chinese themselves were making hashish. There's no evidence for that at all. But silk as a product is much better suited for that filtration process than cotton is.
Mm-hmm.
You can do that with cotton. You know, those videos in like I've seen Moroccans using rough cotton and Chitralis in Pakistan using rough cotton to sieve things. It does work, but silk's much stronger and it's much better suited to it, and it's not going to leave bits of cotton coming out into the resin or anything, you know.
Yeah, it's actually I made hash recently. It's the most. I don't know if I said this on one of the other podcasts actually. I don't think I did. I think maybe a friend I was telling. Was that it's the best hash I've ever made, and what I did was, it was the method that I kind of stumbled across. It was on like a blog or something, and it was the person saying they make oil first, and then they do the dry sieve method, and then they combine the two, and then they just spend a lot of time making it malleable, pliable. You know, just keep rubbing it and rubbing it all together and all together, and it's just this really beautiful dark resin, which is like, you know, it's again special occasion stuff, you know, and it's a quality high, you know, it's just really mellow. It's, you know, it's a really lovely sensation, opposed to some of the quote unquote pollen that's available, and it's very absent of any form of oily texture, which leaves a relatively I don't know, there's an absence there, and I think it's obviously different hashes, you get different effects and different requirements, like different things. But what's also interesting that you mentioned a minute ago there about how it was obviously the method was very much ingrained in a much greater industrial process, and I think that's what's interesting, is that it's like that's where we need to get back to, because there's a real separation between like food production or clothing production, and then there's cannabis, which is the drug. And the reality is, you know, a specific period of time ago, this is an integrated thing that was all together, you know, and I think that's also, you know, it's of importance with these kind of conversations.
Yeah, like I can see, you know, both sides of it in the sense of obviously I'm totally on the same page as you personally, that it's really good to have that sense of the historical and cultural roots of the product and the plant.
Yeah.
That's definitely a really central focus for me. On the other hand, you know, there's plenty of things we consume, like coffee. I mean, how many people who drink coffee know that that it originates with Sufi mystics chewing the beans to stay awake all night?
Right, is that right? Yeah.
In the Yeah, yeah. So I mean, the plant itself, I think, it originates in East Africa, sort of Ethiopia type area, but very quickly crossed over to places like Yemen and so on. And yeah, there's a trance meditation practices that the Sufis do that they stay awake all night doing, and they would chew the kind of thing practices that people be smoking cannabis with these days, incidentally. But yeah, they would chew the coffee beans to stay awake. You know, so it wasn't even I don't think roasted. It was just a sort of raw thing that you would chew. You know,
Right.
the story goes that the sort of discovery story. You know, and there's equivalent stories with cannabis, but the discovery story with the myth, whatever origin myth with coffee, is that the goat herd was walking around the mountains in Ethiopia or around that bit of the world anyway, and saw his goats suddenly get very fucking hyperactive and noticed that they'd been chewing a particular plant, you know,
Right.
and so what's that? And yeah. So what I'm saying is you don't need to, you know, it's not, I just don't want to come across like I'm being pious about it. Like, oh, you don't really, you're not really a real cannabis person if you don't know the hashish probably originates in, you know, 10th century Baghdad or whatever. But you know, it is good to know. I think it's good to know about it. You know,
So,
coffee is an interesting one because, sorry, yeah, you can stop me if I'm going off.
no, on you go, man, on you go.
I was just going to say that you know, actually, the funny thing is that it arrived in Britain a long time before tea, you know, coffee.
Right.
And even though it's, you know, tea is considered our sort of national drink compared to coffee, whereas Americans obviously, you know, they stopped drinking tea because of all the politics of tea and Boston Tea Party and that, and coffee is much more the national stimulant of choice there, or cocaine being the other one. But anyway, like the point being that coffee was in London, you know, went from being like by the time coffee had got to the UK, I think via Turkey in places, the way it got used when it was in London was in what in the down in the city of London, in the down by the Thames, and in the business districts. They'd sit in the coffee houses discussing business, discussing politics, and many of these coffee places subsequently became, or rather, one of the particularly famous coffee houses is what then became the London Stock Exchange. You know.
All right.
Yeah, so that, you know, they go down there to trade shares and that, and eventually it actually just became the stock exchange. You know.
Right.
So it shows how once one culture gets hold of something, it can radically change the meaning and use of it within the space of within decades, you know, very quickly.
Mm.
Uh,
No, it's fascinating, man, and I think it is important. Yeah, I know, obviously, we're not saying that like if you're going to engage with any form of cannabis consumption, you need to know the history and all that kind of
no,
stuff.
no, no.
100%
Yeah,
agree, man. But what I find quite interesting and what's apparent
yeah,
is individuals who, and I think obviously like CBD's helped, medical consumption in the UK 2018 onwards has helped, but there are a lot of new people coming to cannabis, and there's a lot of new people that are engaged in like, oh, cannabis consumption here, 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 and I think there's something that's to be said. I don't know, for let's say, man, it's like no try to be the old fucking dickhead or anything like that kind of stuff, but there's something that kind of feel like a bit absent about when people are like um completely absent of where it was before it got to them being available to consume it. because there's a lot of
Yeah.
fucking difficulty and hardship, and people have been prosecuted still to this day. But all these, there's too many factors involved for it to be just like, no, we've got it now, it's fine. You know, it's like, no, there has to be some form of something that makes you grateful that this is now available, because we have to endure tons of fucking bullshit to get to the point where you can go and buy it legally. You know, and
Yeah, yeah,
you know, and I
absolutely.
think it's like the
Well,
Starbucks culture. That's what it feels like. It feels like this. Oh, we've got a coffee, so this is all good to go. Now it's corporate branded, and here we are. And it's like, fuck, man. There's a lot of fucking history behind your ability to consume cannabis. So fucking be grateful and hear some information, which should give you more of a perspective.
yeah, and I think one of the sort of bickering argumentative things on you might have seen on the Instagram account that I was having was with someone who was arguing that all every single I'll try and give a relatively fair version of what they were saying, but basically that we need to recognize a lot of the strains that have been created in the Prohibition era in the underground as being, you know, true cultivars in the way that there are loads like in the formal you know that are in the kind of registry of cultivars, you know, that are formally recognized in the way that you have a lot of that already with hemp, like finola and stuff, you know. And I got into foolishly, I just should have not commented, but into an argument with someone who was saying that, you know, essentially anything you find on a seed bank catalog qualifies as being a cultivar in that sense, based on their understanding of how to read some attempts that have been made to how to legislate for this. And I totally understand why people sort of emotionally want that, because it's you know, it can be pretty hurtful for someone who's been growing most of their life in an illegal context to then have legalization come along, and then all these kind of experts tell them, oh well, your plants aren't actually up to that level of refinement that they qualify as that. You know, they're not true breeding in the way that the legislation I would say clearly requires them to be from seed. You know, anyway, they'll get into a whole other discussion there, but suffice to say, like even the relatively brief history of cannabis in the West, you know, most people don't have an appreciation of how it came about, and increasingly, if they've grown up in a legal state, don't even necessarily have an awareness of the shit people went through in the Prohibition era and how many people's lives got fucking wrecked by those laws, you know, and still are actually. I mean, you know, you get a criminal record for cannabis in the UK that can, to this day, really fuck up the rest of your chances of getting a job, you know.
Yeah.
But anyway, yeah, with life-changing consequences, you know. But anyway, going back to the traditional aspect of it, yeah, you know, I don't think, you know, the modern I personally still like the traditional products the most. You know, dry sieved resin gives you the fullest representation of the phytochemical profile of the plant that you can have, the sort of pure in the purest sense. Having said which, I'm about to contradict myself. You know, sinsemilla, actually, because there's a lot of other phytochemicals that aren't going to go that aren't in the actual resin glands themselves that you get when you smoke bud as it is, you know. So there's a type of effect that you can get from if you were to take the same plant and smoke it as bud, hand rub the charis from it, or dry sieve it, you'll get a very different effect from each three ways of preparing it, you know. But personally, I don't think any of the modern things have really the modern ways of preparing it, like shatter and all that kind of whatever, has it's not kind of, you know, what's the word, it's not taking it to some whole new fucking level, in my opinion, you know. Like in the sense that I think dry sieved hash is the best way if you want the sort of the most connoisseur experience of cannabis. I think it's still that, if it's good.
Yeah, no, I agree fully. No, I really do. And it's what's interesting is it pops to mind. I've got a friend who, maybe a couple of months back, maybe 6 weeks or so, he gave me a dab for the first time, and it wasn't even a full
Right.
dab. It was like a fucking draw of a dab of one that he had, just to be
Mhm.
cautious. And I was fucking, and I was ripped all day. But one of the things that I
Yeah.
found, and I was extremely grateful that gave me the opportunity. But one of the things I found was it just, I don't know, it's the sensation. And in two minds. So there's two things that I've kind of felt when I think back to it now. One of the things that it felt like it was the most um, connective with. It felt it felt the most. It was as if the receptors had been most activated, and not in a sense where it was like the best experience. It felt clinical. That's what it kind of felt like. It felt like it was like a. I don't know. I'm probably describing it terribly, but
No, no, I get what you're probably
and
referencing. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I don't know if it's because of the fact that when you're consuming it through hash or consuming it through smoke or consuming it through whatever, that you get additional factors, variables which complement the experience. But that's what I took from it. It just felt very clinical, and I felt that actually when I went to Amsterdam and I had the volcano. I didn't. It wasn't something I was like, I really enjoyed that. And I look forward to doing that again. It felt like it was. I felt like it was like the cleanest form of connecting with the receptors at the same time as not feeling the most enjoyable. That's what it felt like.
Yeah, I kind of see a lot of these things as coming out of a prohibition context in a way. The whole emphasis on potency and emphasis on getting fucking as obliterated as possible. I
Yeah.
think the obliteration emphasis is actually partly a Northern European thing.
Right.
Right? Like you'd be surprised, I think, or rather, you wouldn't be surprised. It's just words
Mhm.
blubbering out of my mouth, but I think a lot of people don't appreciate how much the pre-cannabis history of and the types of drugs that a culture has before it encounters cannabis will influence how people or any other drug that is any when any like for example British attitudes to drugs that we don't have a long history with are shaped by the drugs that we did have before that, right? So
Right.
in England, in the UK, the drugs that we have historically had around for a long time are alcohol, and then the solanaceous would be the right word, I think, like deadly nightshades, datura, henbane, the sort of hexing herbs that quote unquote witches would use, right?
Right.
They're the ones that have been around in the British Isles for a long, long time, and that people, and all of them are drugs that just fuck you up, right?
Mhm.
They get you fucking wrecked, skulled, you lose your mind. Like enough booze and you black out, enough datura, you're probably dead. But enough, all of those. And that's what they're deliriants. They get you delirious and fucked up.
Mhm.
And that's primarily how Northern Europeans approach alcohol is as a way of getting fucked up.
Mhm.
Compared to say Southern Europe, where you primarily drink with food socially as a way of sort of enhancing conversation, and it's a sort of a decadent thing.
Mhm.
Whereas if you go into any British town centre on a Saturday night,
Yeah.
you see people sprawling around the place, lying in the gutters and whatever.
Smashed it their fucking mind.
Yeah. And so our attitude to cannabis, and this will feed through into the United States as well, is like is primarily it's just a way of getting. I'm overstating it, but that would be the dominant attitude, and if people who don't have experience of cannabis, who are sort of anti-cannabis, will primarily understand it unless they've really made an effort to understand it as just a way of getting fucked up.
Mhm.
The discourse around all of these substances is still like that. So if there's a new thing that's coming along, like all the stuff with fentanyl and things,
Yeah.
not that fentanyl itself is that new, but um, the problem with it, they'll talk about, all right, 6,000 times more potent than morphine or whatever, right?
Mhm.
It is by weight, but a lot of people, when they hear that 6,000 times, whatever, it is, when they hear that on the news, they will understand that to mean that you get 6,000 times more fucked up on it.
Mhm.
Whereas actually, I think I mean, I've never never tried it, never intend to, but I would assume, as far as I'm aware, the effect of all opiates on a subjective level is more or less the same, right?
Mhm.
It's just that fentanyl is much more fucking dangerous, and you can kill yourself with it accidentally much more easily.
Mhm.
So people overdose on it. But the assumption is when and then when they're reporting on these things, you see people wandering around, fucked out of their minds. But that's mostly because they've just taken way too fucking much, and they're mixing it with tranquilizers and alcohol, and it's all like poly drug use, you know.
Yeah.
And anyway, this whole culture of sort of drugs being things that are a route to oblivion,
Mm-hmm.
basically,
Mm-hmm.
it is a Northern European thing. Whereas if you go to cultures like in the Andes or whatever, they chew coca as a stimulant. If you go to India, they primarily use cannabis as a kind of a tonic, you know, like in just quite an old-fashioned idea, but as a way of getting of kind of taking the rough edges off the day, the physical wear and tear, the lack of food, you know,
Yeah.
that's the main way to use in like North India, to use cannabis and opium as well, you know.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's
Is
actually
that
perfect you saying
yeah.
that, actually, because it's one of the reasons why I don't. I mean, I'm not a social smoker anymore whatsoever.
Mhm.
It's like I
Yeah, yeah.
consume my method of consumption really is to kind of increase creative thought and productivity. So it's a really small amount. I'll roll a fucking single scanner joint. I'll
Mhm.
have barely half of it and I'll stub it, and that'll do me for like 2, 3 hours. Now, and one of the things that I've noticed, that's why I don't go out to big cannabis events and all these different things. And it's brilliant that they do that. It normalizes it and it gets it into the public sphere. Um, and it's the intentions in a positive light, but I think one of the things that I've found is that if you go to one of these events and then you get offered a dab and you go, "Ah, no thanks," it's very often taken as it's like, "Nah, what the fuck? What's your problem? I thought you were on our team," and it's just like,
Yeah,
"No,
yeah,
that's
yeah.
just not my thing," I'm just not
You're
wanting
not
to get
part of the tribe.
exactly. I like to be in
Yeah.
control, and I think it was when I interviewed Tommy Chong fucking last year or the year before, whenever it was. He said this thing where he was like, he wants to control the cannabis, he doesn't want it to control him. And I
Mm-hmm.
think that's how I
Yeah.
feel about it as well. It's like it's all about maximizing your ability to think. For me personally, I am aware there are people out there who's like their medical condition and all that kind of stuff will require a huge amount of overconsumption in the loosest term, just to neutralize any pain. That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is people that are in the privileged position of consuming cannabis for enjoyment, and it's that, and I'm definitely in the category now where it's like I feel cautious about. That's why I was really caught with my mate. That's why he turned around. He was like, he made the dab and he looked at me. He's like, "You want this?" I've already had it the first bit. It's only a small amount. I was like, "Fuck it, safe environment, all that shit." But
No,
yeah,
I'm
that's
with you 100% on that, man. I mean, I don't I like I have and do and will smoke cannabis socially
mhm,
sometimes,
yeah,
but normally in places like you know, where I feel comfortable, you know, I don't feel kind of like there's too many people that I don't know or that I'm not, you know, sure about or around, you know, anything to sort of trigger an anxious experience, you know. I
exactly.
would,
And
yeah.
I felt it slightly when, because I went to Amsterdam in 2014, I think it would have been, and I was only there for 3 or 4 days, and that's what I felt when I was in the coffee shop. So it was like it
It's a
wasn't
terrible place to
comfortable.
get stoned if you ask me.
It was fucking shit, man. It was so shit. It wasn't until I got out and then we're walking around and I'm sitting there.
Yeah,
At one point, one of the best
yeah, yeah.
experiences was got stoned and I'm sitting at the side of the canal with my fucking feet hanging over essentially. And there's a wee pigeon that with one leg fucking landed next to me. 15 minutes I'm looking at this thing. It was the best experience. The whole holiday, man. I was like, this pigeon, man. Me and that fucking pigeon connected, bro. And that's literally what I was like. And I
That's
think
what you know, because it opens you up to it's a sensory enhancer a lot of the time, you know,
yeah,
even the more stony stuff, and you don't necessarily want to be open to all sensory inputs and vibes that are coming at you in an urban environment in Amsterdam, you know.
yeah.
But I mean,
That's exactly what it
Mel
felt like.
Frank, you know, sorry,
On you go, man.
uh, Mel Frank, who's one of the characters I mentioned before, who you know, it's him and David Watson who and Rob Clark. Uh, um, but you know, it was Mel Frank and David Watson who bought the handful of foundational strains over to Amsterdam that nearly everything everyone smokes is based on these days. You know,
Right.
skunk, Afghani number one, haze, Northern Lights, and you can look at the old what was it, Breeder's Choice, I think. What was the name of the anyway, you can find the old catalogs online. The reason I mention it, sorry, I'm just going off on a tangent again, is that there's a few very worth watching videos of Mel Frank on YouTube where he's at one of those kind of cannabis fairs and they're interviewing him about this history, and the guy who's interviewing him is fucking out of his gourd already, you know, and he's trying to get Mel Frank to smoke, and Mel's just like, you can actually see he's quite irritated, you know. So
Yeah.
I don't want to, I can't, I don't want to do this like when I'm fucking stoned out of my mind trying to tell you about these things and sit in this room, I could totally see that he's a similar. Most people who smoke long term, I think, with very few exceptions, end up smoking the way that you've described. Like when you're uh, using it for work and like enhancing your creativity and flow or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Most people end up smoking in that way who are long-term, lifelong smokers.
Yeah.
Um, Dave Watson, actually, ironically, the Sam Skunk Man, is an example of someone who doesn't, who really, really likes to get fucked up. He even says, "I enjoy the paranoia."
Right. Okay.
Yeah, and
Fuck that. That's enough of
yeah,
me.
I
Like I've had
think
enough paranoia in my life. I'm needing fucking more, man. Fuck that shit.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah, it's funny actually. Just talking about this, actually, there was a video that popped to mind, and it was really funny. And this lady clearly was not a. This must have been maybe even her first holiday. I don't know what the fuck it was, but what was so funny was, so it was a YouTube video. It was extremely short, and it's funny why, quite honestly. So she's walking through one of these events, cannabis events, and there's people obviously just filling dabs, giving it to random strangers, this kind of thing. So she walks over to a table and she's got her camera open. She's like, "Oh, okay," and very polite, very well spoken lady. And she's like, "Oh, what's this? Oh, a dab." So she like she's got her hand to the left, so the camera kind of goes out with, and she's still holding it to her arm's length, and she leans in, she gets this dab, the guy fucking does the stuff, and then she brings in, she goes, and then you see her coughing like, and then she didn't even speak to the guy after it. She walks away for this fucking stall, and she's like, and then eventually the camera she just cuts it off. It's fucking out of nowhere, and then the next thing is, and then the next scene is her at night time, and it was all sunny when she had the thing, so the next scene's her at night time in her pajamas, fucking candlelight, like, oh my goodness, what an experience, it's that.
yeah,
Hilarious, because I was like, that woman
yeah.
must have spent about 8 hours being like sweating
Oblivion.
like
Yeah,
fuck, you know what I mean? She lost about 3 stone in weight, and it was
yeah,
just one of those things, and it's like I was like 100% in that position where it's like, nah, man, I just want to relax, want to enjoy it, want to just, it's just because there was a long period of time, quite honestly, where because of the social environment that I was consuming cannabis and the feeling I was getting from it, I was like, I should stop smoking. This isn't
yeah.
helpful. I'm not enjoying this. This isn't, and I like it was that almost synonymous thing where it's like cannabis and socialization. It's like, well, the two of them together. That's so if you're not enjoying the feeling, then you just stop smoking. And what I begun to enjoy it once I was like detached from the social aspect of it and just begun to just engage on my own smoking it essentially. Because I'm the same, just what you're talking about getting stoned and having to fucking talk, having to detail shit. It's like, fuck's sake, man. It's like that because sometimes on podcasts in the past, and I'd just be sitting there, have a joint, it'd be nice, and even the other week, I think I did the same thing. And it's just a small amount. Because one of the things I've noticed is that like you end up. I'd say this to my mate actually a couple of weeks back. We were out working. He does gardening, and I know, ironically, and one of the things he'd said was he doesn't like smoking grass anymore, flower, because he's like it's too loud in his head, and he's like it's just hash. And one of the funny things I found was I was like I'm the same. I understand what you mean. When you smoke hash, it doesn't seem to fuck with the voice in your head as much as high potency flower.
I
When you
think it
smoke.
just depends on what you've got. Do you mean like import hash or like
Well, to be honest, the hash that's local, yeah, yeah, exactly. Like
oh, so
import,
Sort of Moroccan like
yeah,
fully sort of dried resin or like good hash or like
yeah, exactly. That exactly. That's what
but I
he's
mean
talking
what
about.
I'm gonna say is like there's because if you get the more like low grade sort of dusty Moroccan, often it's like fucking um only like a few percent THC and then probably got equal amounts of CBD or sometimes even more CBD than it's got THC in it.
Hmm. Hmm.
Which is like sorry I talked over you again, but
That's all
yeah,
right, man.
the CBD there's a pretty good evidence base that it's
Yeah,
quite good
neutralizes.
at yeah it keeps it's an anxiolytic or whatever the technical term is for something that like cuts through the anxiety.
Yeah, exactly.
uh
And I think
yeah
that's what he was trying to get at. It was that
yeah
hash doesn't make. That's what he talked about. He's like, it's like I'm fucking in my head all the time. And I was like, I know that feeling where it's like you've smoked like really strong flower, and all of a sudden you hear the voice in your head almost with a fucking microphone shouting at you. You're like, fuck, and
mm.
every movement is like, what was his name? It was Louis C.K. He talked about it in one of his shows when he says this thing when he's like he's getting stoned by a bunch of teenagers after his show, guys in their early 20s, and they say to him like, and he's like, I've not been stoned in ages, and he was like, some of the guys in his show at the end was like, hey, you want to fucking smoke some pot after the show? He's like, oh, definitely. So he says he's having a couple of draws off it, and the guy's like taking big fucking like he called it big 1970s bad company hits. He's like fucking denim jacket, fucking that kind of shit. And the guy, he's like the fucking teenage guy. He says with a big hoop in his ear, saying to him, "Whoa, whoa, whoa, slow down, man. That's fucking some strong shit." He's like, "Nah, it's fine." He says, and then about 10 seconds later, he's like, "Pew!" He's like, "Oh shit, this is an ordeal now." And it was the thing when he turns around and says it. He's like, "It was this." He went, "Everybody can tell that the way the wind's hitting my arm's weird. Everybody can know that the wind's hitting my arm weird." And it's that kind of shit. You're like, "This isn't fun, man. Fuck this." Oh.
yeah
But no, it's quite funny, like, but no, to go back to the preservation in Angus, it was like, how would you like methods? One of the things that's written here is like informing local farmers who are cultivating these things. Is that a method you think that would be able to preserve what it is that they're cultivating? And is that like practical? Do you think that's a thing that it's like because they're going to obviously, or are they just solely focused? They're not bothered about tradition. They're just focused on maximizing yield and profit.
Well, I mean, in terms of preser preservation, like the speed at which hybrid seed is arriving, or has already arrived in most traditional areas of cultivation, means that the emphasis now has got to be on like ex situ preservation.
Right.
You just got to get the seeds into germplasm banks, seed banks, and do maintenance grows ex situ, get it all stored, and there's no perfect solution because you're always going to have a limit to the number of plants you can grow. I mean, the projects that I know have contributed to, they aim to use like 200 parent plants per accession for the maintenance grows to produce more seed to store in, and they'll send it off to, Svalbard and all these seed bank places, right?
Mm-hmm.
And basically the other idea, which according to the protocols for these things, the UN and stuff have for this type of preservation work, ideally you want to do these things in the source countries where you can, but it's just not realistic in most places because in most places it's still an illegal crop,
Mm-hmm.
and plus pollen travels far,
Yeah.
So if you're for context, like if you're breeding hemp in the EU, I think you have to the mandated limit must be that there's no other hemp cultivation within a sort of 5 kilometer distance,
Right.
So because of how far the pollen travels, and even that's a suboptimal thing because it can go much further than 5 kilometers, and it's produced in vast amounts. One male, I think, can produce like 50 grams of pollen potentially,
Right.
and that's an awful lot of pollen grains flying around. I mean, in certain bits of the world where cannabis is a naturally occurring or naturalized weed, certain times of year in the Himalayas and stuff, like almost all the pollen in the air is cannabis because it's just fucking crowding all the other stuff out. It's vast amounts of it are produced.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, the emphasis has to be on just getting collecting as much as possible and getting it to projects that are preserving it, in freezing minus whatever it is they do centigrade places once they've made more seed. And yeah, I was invited like to go to one sort of discussion forum thing. I forget the name of it, but talking about how do we preserve different traditional plants, and not just cannabis, other ones, other important crops that are associated with traditional cultures. And uh, the problem is, yeah, you can do all that talking, but it's like literally like every fucking year the situation gets dramatically worse, even for a plant like cannabis,
Mm-hmm.
And so it's all very well, but it basically the emphasis has to be just on actually practically collecting it all,
Mm-hmm.
And even if you were to have a government, like say hypothetically, like if Nepal decided, right, we're going to legalize, they don't have the capacity, even if they wanted to enforce what's going on in the middle of the mountains 300 kilometers away on the fucking like remote bit of the mountains up by Tibet or somewhere,
Yeah.
It's just simply, how do you even fucking staff that? It's one of the reasons why Thailand like is now, Thailand is going back and decided, well, we're going to prohibit this again, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's only going to be allowed for like medical production and medical consumption. But like,
Sorry to
They're
interrupt. Is that
just,
sorry to interrupt? Is that what the fuck was that all about? By the way, was that just because of the fact they're like, wow, this is a fucking minefield. Let's just go back because now it's a mess.
um, I, it's a discussion I had like elsewhere. It might have been with someone else. But if you sort of read on my site where I talk about Thai stick and the extent to which because you know Thai stick is the name that is a sort of Western brand name that goes back to the late 60s, early 70s when that was like the best sinsemilla in the world came from Thailand, right?
Hmm.
So we call it Thai stick, and you if you talk to sort of Westerners who've even been over to these places or were there in the hippie trail era in Thailand and stuff, they'll say, yeah, it was part of the culture, you know, it is part of the culture. Um, that's debatable, you know, it's debatable to do. If you said to, if you were to randomly pick someone in India and say, is cannabis part of your culture? Even if they're Hindu, a lot of them say, no, it's not. No, it's just a sort of it's for drug addicts, you know?
All right.
And if you were to pick randomly, you know, stand on the street and just randomly ask passers-by in Bangkok, is cannabis part of is part of Thai culture? You probably get a majority of Thais to say no, it's not. You
Right.
know, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm trying. I'm not trying to be a killjoy. It's just like, um, realistically, a lot of people, most people, majority of people probably don't approve of it. You know,
Right.
and sadly, you know,
Hmm.
and the political party in Thailand that did this legalization thing uh, that's now being reversed. Like the ones that actually started it, it's a part, I forget the name, but they're a party from Isan, which is the northeast bit of Thailand. It's a big area of Thailand. It's very densely populated, but very poor. And most families are farming families. It's an area that has historically been hit a lot by drought. You know, it's a tough bit of the country to live in. It's a bit like being from the fucking Scottish Highlands or something, you know, in
Hmm.
the 19th century or whatever, you know.
Yeah.
And so a lot of people emigrate to go to other places to work, you know. So if you're in Bangkok, which is the one big city of Thailand, there's just like no other cities that are even close in terms of size. If you're in Bangkok and you get into a taxi or someone's bringing you food or you're buying some packaged thing in the 7-Eleven, it's someone from Isan that's probably packaged it up for you, cut up the fruit into slices, is cleaning your toilet in the hotel, is driving your taxi, you know. So it's the poor bit of the country, and they get looked down on by far too many non-Isan Thais, you know, and they speak Lao, they don't speak Thai, you know. And that's the bit of the country where all of the Thai state used to come from was Isan, right? And it came from northern Isan right up on the river, on the Mekong River, just opposite Lao. And if you went to the places where they produced Thai stick, everyone spoke Lao, you know,
Right.
and still speaks Lao outside of the center of the town. You know, you go to the village, everyone will speak Lao, you know,
Hmm.
and so culturally, really, like Thai stick was really a Lao thing. So you know, when I, it's not to say that it's not a thing you find in rural Thailand. You will find it all throughout rural Thailand. So when I first went out of, you know, 15 years ago, where it would have been 20 years ago, out looking for Thai strains in Thailand. I did what most people would do and just initially just sort of headed off to places that I knew it was easy as just a random tourist just turning up. It was easy to buy ganja, you know, so Gochang, Kochang, whatever you want to call it. It was one of the big sort of stoner islands, you know. And I headed over that way, and then I met people and went with that. Met like people who said, "Oh yeah, you can come to meet my uncle. He grows ganja. You know, it
Hmm.
takes a long time to get a Thai to trust you enough to, or
Yeah.
just you know, it's to put themselves in that risky position. You know, it's not
Yeah.
easy. It's not easy to meet Thai ganja farmers compared to say like Nepal, where you can just be like, oh yeah, just come to my village, and you know,
Hmm.
Thailand, it's like it's just because there's much higher risk for them. You know. Anyway, get to the this uncle's farm, and yeah, he's been growing ganja in his rice fields, you know, and like hidden in amongst the corn and stuff. And but he's just basically saying to me like, the fuck, why are you here? Like, why didn't you just go to Laos, you know? Just say like, why? What are you doing? Like, it's like looking for fine wine in, you know, in Devon when you could just go across to Bordeaux or whatever, you know.
Yeah.
And yeah, so it's like, and then if you look in the historical, the few bits of writing you can find in Thai, old Thai literature, um, the earliest things you can find are basically describing what was a horrific sequence of wars between the Lao and the Thai. You know, there was a very kind of bold king in Lao who sort of tried to expand Lao out into Thailand um, and was quite successful. And then the Thais were just like, fuck this, and pushed him all the way back into Lao and just massacred everyone in the capital city in Lao, and then took all of the people and the people in the city and just moved them all like into Isan. Reason being that the Thais wanted to sort of, they wanted a tax base, you know. The problems that they always had in Thailand was that the population density was too low.
Mm.
And so a ruler couldn't kind of accumulate the necessary resources to be a strong kingdom, you know. So they moved all these Lao people in as slaves into Isan. Yeah, so they were slaves, you know. And so the kind of Lao culture the culture in North Isan is basically, yeah, it's like Lao, you know. They'll even call it Muang Lao, you know. It's like, it just means like Lao land, you know, if you talk to people there, you know, even though they're in Thailand, you know. But yeah, anyway, so I've the point of all of this fucking great excursus was that basically, yeah, it's not it's an ambivalent part. It's cannabis is everything. It's been in Thailand for several hundred years, but it's got a very ambivalent status. And if you look in those old the earliest mentions of it are making very clear that they're in this big historical epic, and they're saying they're these fucking scumbag Lao scumbags smoking this dirty plant cannabis, you know.
Right.
They're mercenaries, mercenaries fighting for the enemy. It's a scene where they're locked up in this they're in prison and they're sitting in there smoking their bongs, you know. This is sort of 18th century, I guess.
Mm.
And then as a herb, it doesn't make its way into the sort of traditional Thai herbal medicine until much later on, even than the 18th century. It's like way well into the 19th century, I think, when you finally get cannabis included in the royal herbals of the Thai kingdom.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, and I went to speak to a very famous Thai herbalist who ironically he's Thai herbalist, but he's actually from Laos. But he used to present the former king, every year, the sort of, you know, his herbs and stuff, because he was particularly famous for being good at making all these different traditional herbal medicines. And yeah, he was like, yeah, of course I know cannabis. I'm from Laos, but it's like it's not part of Thai herbal medicine, really, you know. But
Right.
he knew things you could do with it, but it wasn't. It's a relatively in the scheme of things, it's a new arrival in Thailand
Mm-hmm.
from the point of view of the Thais, as in Bangkok, Central Thai, you know.
Yeah, yeah. That's fascinating, man, because that's the thing you would think. I don't know if it's just naivety or ignorance on my part, most likely. It's just that you would think it would be integrated fucking thousands of years ago through medical practices and just
No.
general cultural knowledge, you know.
Well, the thing is, we always it's a sort of bugbear of mine to some extent, the assumption that all these things are really ancient.
Mm-hmm.
It it doesn't mean. I mean, it's
I think maybe because of the fact that the plant is so well known through like thousands of years ago, you would assume that these at the time what would be archaic cultures would have been utilizing them to their full potential. I think that's where that's where my mind lives, you know.
well, the thing is if you look at the archaeological pollen records, which is how there's papers by like John McPartland, who I mentioned before.
Mm-hmm.
He did one on you know, trying to work out where cannabis evolved, how ancient it is in various bits and bits of the world, and the way you can work that out is by looking at fossil pollen. You know, you take big slices of the land and how far down back into the past you still find cannabis pollen.
Mm-hmm.
You just don't find it at all in tropical mainland Southeast Asia. It just wasn't. It's just not around as a plant until Whereas if you go north, if you imagine going north from Thailand up towards what is sort of into across the political borders into China, as it now is, and up into the eastern Tibet, what sort of Sichuan and Yunnan and places up into the mountainous areas there, you will find, wild cannabis has been there for millions of years, tens of millions of years. But down into the tropics, in what's now sort of, if, for example, around Bangkok, if you went out into the rice farms there and sliced down into the land, you're not going to find any cannabis pollen beyond about 200 years ago,
I was thinking that in the context of the UK. So I mean, I take it history for cannabis in the UK. That's probably what, 400 or 500 years ago, Age of Enlightenment style.
Romans
that
probably
kind of
bought
stuff.
it as hemp,
Right.
It's not actually. I can't sort of talk off the top of my head with any great authority on that because I just haven't the hemp side of things. I don't go that deep into, in terms of Europe. But the Romans would have bought it. They'd have been using it. That would have been when cultivation in the UK. I mean, Hempstead and places and all that. Probably go back to that kind of thing somewhere. But it's but not as a drug plant, it was a fiber plant and a grain, primarily a fiber plant for cordage and rigging ships and that kind of stuff was what it's got a history of in Europe,
Yeah.
To encounter it being used as a drug, you have to go in Europe. I think it doesn't in sort of modern-ish history, as it were. You've got to go over towards Turkey and places. Greece has a history of it, growing it to produce hashish when it got banned in Egypt in the late 19th century, sort of 1860s-ish. Then the sort of smuggling networks in the Eastern Mediterranean took the seeds over to Greece and taught the farmers up in the Peloponnese and things how to grow it and make dry sift hash, which would then be smuggled back across to Egypt. And then, of course, the Ottoman Empire was a big hash place. The Turks, so the areas that the Turks colonized in Eastern Europe, certainly, it would have been there as long as the Turks were there. Romania and Bulgaria and Albania and places. From the 15th century onwards. So 500-600 years, but in terms of really ancient history, it was the Scythians who, based on the fossil pollen and the historical records, it was the Scythians who bought cannabis as a drug, as a multi-purpose drug fiber seed plant up to the frontiers of Europe about 3,000 years ago-ish. It was there before them, but it as a natural as a wild growing plant. But there was a point where the climate in Europe changed and it sort of vanished again. We're talking thousands and thousands and thousands of years ago before people brought it over there.
Yeah.
But in terms of people bringing it west, it was the Scythians who were kind of Iranian speaking. Or Iranic would be clearer to put it, because they're not from what we now think of as Iran, but these nomadic people who dominated like most of Central Eurasia, Central Asia, right over to the frontier of the Han Chinese realms, and then all the way across to the western side of the Black Sea to sort of Romania, Bulgaria area. Culturally, sort of dominated the whole of the center of Eurasia, the Eurasian landmass. Right down to the frontiers of India and places. They were, they're probably like, if you wanted the sort of original cannabis culture in terms of using drugs, it's using it to get high, it's the Scythians. That the evidence for that is like 100% unequivocal evidence goes back sort of 2,500 years plus.
It's fascinating actually when you think about the distance we've came since then to now, and even that try to preserve authentic land races and just have much more biodiverse availability. And it's like one of the things as well where I was thinking like I know it still involves seed collection and preservation, that kind of thing, but like tissue culture, where does that stand in the whole basis of on preserving things that potentially could disappear?
I don't know. I don't know, to be fair, like if anyone, to what extent that's playing a role in it.
So the reason why I say that, Angus, is I watched this
Yeah.
thing obviously prior to the conversation, and when the guy was talking about how, in order to try and preserve some of the genetics he had, I can't remember who the guy was. It was like, oh fuck, I'll never remember his name. But essentially, that was what he was doing. Was he had seeds that were relatively unaffected. They were like, you wouldn't be germinate them, and if at the very minimum you've got like a little tail and nothing will fucking happen. So what he was doing was he was taking a small amount of the DNA of the seed, a small cell, and he was able to elaborate on it to the point where he was able to cultivate um, um, large amounts of this seed that would ordinarily be lying dormant continuously because it had been like stored poorly or something like that. And I just
Yeah.
thought, just the in the context of the conversation, it seemed to be potentially a method which might be effective for preserving genetics and stuff like that. But I know fuck all about it, man. So I'm kind of just sitting here throwing it out with no knowledge
No,
whatsoever.
I mean, yeah, I can't waffle about that. I mean, like I know that it's that there are, Phylos, for example, was using that to build because to build a big map of the cannabis genome,
Mhm.
and which is what uh, a lot of the projects, the preservation projects, have that aspect to them. So,
Mhm.
for example, because it's really useful for breeding, like really serious advanced breeding projects to make kind of advanced future cannabis cultivars,
Right.
like to have these big maps of the genome of the plant, because if
Mhm.
there's a particular trait that they're looking for, like they want purple flower, purple colored plants, whatever,
Mhm.
they will want to find they'll look for that trait in the they'll look at everything they've grown out, and then they'll trace that back to the earliest possible sort of ancestral plant that has that trait,
Mhm.
and use this sort of thing to breed what they're looking for, and they'll do that for all kinds of different characteristics,
Mhm. It's
sex
almost
expression stuff and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, it's almost like we're in the future when I think back to like Syrians consuming it thousands of years ago, and that kind of thing. And now we're at where we're at. There was a post on Instagram, and thankfully all of the comments seem to be pointing towards "fuck this asshole" because the guy had been cultivating, and he was like, "Oh, it's what was it? Was it Easter or fucking Valentine's Day or something like that?" And he had three big fucking what looked like, I don't know, a couple of kilo bags of multicolored cannabis, which was like explicitly pink, blue, and fucking purple or something like that. And it looked like it just been drowned in food coloring.
Right.
And it's that kind of shit. And it's that's what we need to get rid of. That's why legalization needs to be fucking put fully in place, but it needs to be put into the hands of people that are responsible and knowledgeable, and not like the medical circle. I mean, I've got a fucking love-hate relationship with the medical format in the UK, obviously, predominantly because of the fact that it's teething problems, all that kind of shit. But they've essentially, it's like they've done I don't know, is the right way to say it? It's like a de jure? No, it's a de facto fucking thing where they've taken control of it, and it's in the hands of people that have no experience. There's not, and all the people that have been holding up the ability to consume cannabis to this point, it's still
People with the
criminalized.
connections and the
Exactly,
wealth
they,
and the wealth to
100%.
start. Yeah.
That's what it's like. It's that you've got corporate people with money, and then they're like, oh, they see the opportunity there, and then now we'll put some fucking half a dozen clinics in, and I'm aware this is where it comes relatively. It sounds like I'm cynical, but I just feel like it's a
No, I
realistic
can be
thing.
cynical about that. I think, yeah, sorry.
That's what it sounds like. It sounds like I'm being cynical and that kind of stuff, but I'm not. It's just the fact that it's like these people are looking for a profiteering aspect because they see that cannabis is popular, and this is the thing that pisses me off. It's because that they're pushing cannabis and their profit making desire under the basis of medical necessity. And I fucking
Yeah.
hate that. That's what it's like. Fuck you, man. We've waited a long time to make this available to us, and now it's like, okay, well, you can get it available, but it's fucking 200 quid a month, and we're doing it to help everybody. And fuck you, man. You're not doing it to help anybody, and that's what pisses me off.
Well, I mean, the look, I mean, because one thing I always sort of slightly regret not having made clear when I've been having conversations with you before and other people on in a podcast format is to actually sort of set out clearly my sort of politics as regards these things, because I'm like you, I'm not messianic about cannabis in the sense that I recognize it has negative aspects to it.
Yeah, of
For
course.
some people, it can be really bad news for people with serious mental health problems
Hmm.
sometimes,
Hmm.
and so on. But as regards to the politics of it, basically, I'm prepared to say things like that. In fact, I think as someone who sells the seeds, I've got a responsibility to. I feel sometimes I should do more on my sites to sort of put information on there, making it clear that that people need to make informed decisions about smoking the very strong stuff and so on, you know. But anyway, to get to the point I was going to make, which is in terms of the politics of it, you know, my politics of it are 100% libertarian in the sense that I don't think it's anyone's fucking business whether what drugs I consume, you know. If I want to get high, it's no one else's business than mine insofar as my behavior is not affecting anyone else, you know. It becomes a social thing that the government has a right to be involved in if my behavior is like adversely affecting other people.
Yeah,
you know?
sorry to interrupt, Angus. A great example for that. There was a guy that's what's his name? Is it John Stuart Mills? No, that's not, it wasn't him. It's the philosopher. Is that right? John Stuart Mills. He's the philosopher.
Yeah, he's the utilitarian guy,
Yeah.
like the greater good and all that.
Exactly, and he's got this quote where he says, "My right to swing my fist stops at your face."
Yeah, exactly.
You know? And it's exactly that. You know, that's what exactly that.
Yeah. And I think it's a massive overreach for any government to make it its business to tell you what you can or can't consume in that sense, you know, whether it's food or medicines or quote unquote, you know, narcotics, whatever. It's unfortunately very difficult to resolve in democracies because of how democracies work. You know, when they're working well, there should be a kind of a conversation going on a national level through the media and so on that enables people to make informed decisions about how they vote on these things, and parties should, the political parties, you know, in a democracy that's functioning should be reflecting public opinion on this. So in fact, in the UK, I think if the country functioned in that sort of idealized way, I think we'd already have a legal market where you could just buy in the shops the way you can tobacco or booze. But it's such an inflammatory topic, and there's so many people who regard it as a negative thing that most political parties won't take that risk. You know, they're not gonna. There's no way Keir Starmer right now would risk the electoral prospects of Labour on legalizing cannabis, even if he thought that it should be legal. Which most politicians, if you were to speak to them on a personal basis, in fact, probably more in the Tory party, in the Conservative Party in the UK than in the socialist-esque party Labour, more conservatives in the UK would probably say that it should be legal. They're certainly, because they're the posher party, they're the ones that do more drugs anyway. You know, they're all public boys that snort coke and that. You know.
Yeah, exactly, and that's where the hypocrisy lives as well, because it's, you know, Theresa May and her husband comes to mind. You know, and that Nicola Atkins. All these people have invested invested interest in making money from cannabis, whilst at the same time promoting legislation which inhibits ability for the public to get it. You know, and it's like that's fucking. And that's what, like, the idea that it frustrates me when we say we're in a democratic society. It's like, well, really, are we?
It's a plutocracy. I mean, it's a poorly functioning democracy.
Yeah.
Yeah, plutocracy. It's about who you know and how much wealth you've already got. Is, you know, the companies that are involved in the medicinal thing and cannabis are, you know, GW Pharmaceuticals, which owns a lot of the shares in it, and that's Jeffrey Guy. His fortune comes from selling opiates in America.
Right.
You know, and all that stuff like Sackler and things with the opioid crisis in the States. So Jeffrey Guy's fortune comes from developing this sort of so-called slow release type pills. You know.
All right. Okay.
So the ones that if you bought, like, if you had OxyContin, whatever, the ones that are associated with all the massive fatalities in the States and things. You know, 30,000 people a year dying from opiate overdoses from actually sort of prescription medication, you know, or getting addicted because of being on prescription medication. The slow release pills, that stuff comes in where it says on the packet, do not chew, you know. So they're like, oh, okay, I'll chew this then, you know.
Yeah.
And so his fortune, to the best of my knowledge, I should stop. According to James Mills in Cannabis Britannica, who may or may not be right about these things, his fortune comes from that. And so yeah, he's one of the main economic forces in the UK medicinal market. And then there's I think what's her name, Amanda Fielding, who, you know, Fielding, like a very rich old aristocratic family. I think they're one of the Fielding children is trying to get into it or is into it already. And then you've got the Gladstone family, you know, as in the fucking famous prime minister. You know, he's one of the big producers up in Scotland.
Right.
You know, on land that his family's had for centuries, and you know, wealth based on he's got his foot in the door based on wealth that he's inherited. You know, so it's fucking plutocratic as fuck. You know.
Mm-hmm.
Um. Anyway, yeah. I mean, but you know, if we're on this fucking topic, excuse my French,
Not all man,
the
I'm a nightmare for it.
yeah, but the you know David Watson and people who I mentioned bring the people who brought over what the foundational strains of what nearly everyone smokes now, the sort of North American Dutch gene pool that all 99% of hybrids are based on or have in them now because of how everything's just got all mixed together. These two guys who brought that material over to Holland, sort of 85-ish, 1985-ish, they got involved with the UK government as part of a plan that the Tories had to sort of see off attempts to have recreational legalization in the UK. You know, so the Tories had this. Were under a lot of pressure by lobbying groups in the mid 90s, I think it would be early 90s. I forget which government, or maybe maybe it's post Blair, actually, I think. Post Blair, sort of Cameron era, I think it might be. Fuck, I need to. Anyway, it doesn't matter too much that detail, but the point is, it was a conservative government. There was a lot of pressure coming from even like Prince Charles and people who'd heard all about how it can be really good for MS, multiple sclerosis.
Right.
And there was a lot of lobbying from them to legalize it for medical reasons at that point. But there was also a fear that of getting on the Labour and the Tories when they were in power were terrified of getting on the wrong side of the tabloids, the Daily Mail and the Sun and stuff. So they really didn't want to get involved in any kind of national conversation about legalization, you know. So to see off that kind of threat, the Tories decided, right, we're going to make this it has to be, the whole conversation has to be based around the scientific evidence. Like if it can be legalized purely for medicinal reasons, we can just kind of shut up the people who are calling for recreational stuff by saying this is an issue for scientists, you know. And they actually sent a team of civil servants over to Amsterdam to meet David Watson and people and Rob Clark when they had a company called Hortifarm
Right.
in Holland, which had all these strains and things. And again, I have to say allegedly to all of this, allegedly, and then because I'm pretty sure this is true, but it's based on reading James Mills and people. And you can check it all, I'm sure. Anyway, this was before GW Pharmaceuticals existed, right? The Jeffrey Guy who made his fortune in opiates. He formed GW Pharmaceuticals using the sort of library of strains that David Watson sold him.
Right.
And so this is the company that developed Sativex.
Yeah, Epidiolex as well, is that right?
Yeah, Epidiolex and all of that, right? Yeah, so basically that company, GW Pharmaceuticals, which now dominates, I think, via its shareholdings in various companies, the medicinal cannabis industry in the UK, which is the biggest in the world, you know, export-wise and everything. That came about through the Tories kind of wanting to have the whole discourse around cannabis be based around it's only medicinal, only prescription, only for the scientists, you know, to see off any attempts at legalizing it. So, you know, the guy who actually created skunk, or at least brought it to Holland, became part of a project designed to ensure that British people don't have access to recreational cannabis.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's not. I mean, it's
Thing is, that's just to fucking add on top of that, Angus. One of the
Yeah,
things that kind of bugs me is that we have in the UK a couple of very prominent people who are regarded as the experts in cannabis and that kind of thing. And these people, I don't know names, people know who they are, come from these fucking companies.
yeah,
You know what I mean? They come from them in the early, they were working early 2000s with them, and now, it seems to be the fucking gatekeepers of what's
yeah.
acceptable in the UK. And it's very difficult not to be like, hey guys, what the fuck? Because it's like when I wrote the book A Case for Cannabis, that would
Mm.
have been 2018, 2019, yeah, 2018 time. And I, obviously, to make it stand up academically, it's all academically referenced. I was fucking like, it was really intensive research that I went through, and I seen this what seemed to be like a fucking concerted effort of a chain of events which led to the establishment of the medical clinics. And it was a really peculiar set of circumstances which made me think like, hey, this is a fucking it's, I don't like to say conspiracy because people always shut off, but what I'd say is it was like a fucking marketing strategy. That's what it looked like. It was like a business marketing strategy to make it a predominantly medical market, and to separate recreational and medical
But
consumption.
the separating the recreational from the medicinal was a very, very conscious political decision by the Conservatives.
Yeah, well, that's what
And you know, like that thing of them sending a team of civil servants over to Holland
Mhm.
meet Porter Farm, as in Watson and Clark, who were the people who bought skunk or Watson claims to have created skunk
Yeah,
in California in the 70s, bought it up to Holland in the early 80s. Uh, According to him, he never got busted in the States, but according to other people, he was busted in the States,
right.
then moved to uh, Holland. And, you know, hypothetically, it's possible that the reason the British government knew about him was because he was already, according to some people, he was part of he according to some people, he had struck a deal with the DEA to uh, inform on any kind of non-cannabis hard drug stuff going on in Holland. You know,
Right, right.
again, I have no idea if that's true or not, but there's a Dutch radio series that was done about this quite some time ago, and you know, Holland is always been a major smuggling point for
Yeah.
everything in Europe. But anyway, yeah, no, it was absolutely completely sidetracked you. Sorry, but yeah,
No, it's not.
it wasn't a marketing. It was a very, very conscious political decision by the Tories
Mhm.
to keep themselves safe from the tabloids and safe from any discussion developing about legalizing cannabis.
Yeah, because even at the moment,
To
because that's the same
medicalize the
thing.
whole thing.
Like 2018, fucking, the that's the thing that kind of, it was a really bizarre thing, right? That was the most, like, it's like people that have just arrived to cannabis will not be aware, but up until 2018, obviously there was the like, come on, legalize, 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 over and over and over and over. Now, reaching 2018. These medical clinics were beginning to be established before any change of legislation, right? Which when I'm researching for the book and that kind of thing, that was what was becoming apparent. You're looking at as early as 2013, 2014, there seemed to be a very obvious, like, right, we're going to put facilities in place to capitalize on legislation that's not even fucking here yet. And then what happened in 2017, 2018 was that then there was a huge uproar of children requiring cannabis for epilepsy, and that seemed to be the like push forward, push forward, push forward. So what they did was they created through Theresa May a fucking, what did it called it? It was like a community, a reference group, a panel. That's what it was like. It was a panel of so-called professionals, which were the panel which decided if the child was acceptable for getting cannabinoid medicine. And this was obviously 2018 after it became legal medically. And this is what's so frustrating is that less than fucking a handful of children got the fucking medical cannabis that was required, and then the panel was disbanded immediately. So
Yeah,
there wasn't even a panel to then reference. So we had this opening of UK medical cannabis is now available without an authoritative body to facilitate people that required the medicine. And that there is like that was fucking predetermined, because then what happened after that? They could then put the brakes on it because nationwide news publicly had the impression of, well, hey, cannabis is legal now. And since 2018, what's that, 6 years, almost 7 years since this happened, 30,000 people have been able to access it. Come on, man, this is not fucking. Anybody looking properly would see that this is not I don't believe it's through ignorance whatsoever. I don't believe that it's like, oh, we're just not informed enough, or because of the fact that you have to have doctors that sign up to the General Medical Council, or all these different other factors which people say that these are the reasons why it's been slowed. Collectively, perhaps, maybe these have an influence, but it seems to be like the overarching circumstance is delay, maximize fucking profiteering, and that seems to be the mentality in the UK at the least, and it's, I don't know, it just sounds like I'm being a fucking dick and be sinister, but it's just like, come on, man, this
No,
isn't it, you know?
no. I mean, it's unquestionably that is an example of a very premeditated process. It's obviously got an element of chaos in it because it's the Tories, the Conservatives, who are like notoriously fucking uh, messy.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean the UK is the largest producer and exporter of cannabis for medicinal and scientific purposes in the world.
Yeah.
By a country mile. Like that's at least in 2023 we still were.
Hmm.
And so yeah, like the UK population itself has real trouble accessing it. I do have one friend who has got a prescription for chronic migraine.
Hmm.
Just helps symptomatically with it,
Hmm.
and he's managed to get a prescription. But
But
you
even
know,
that's, I mean, sorry to interrupt, because that's one of the things that does, it kind of pisses me off a little bit, because I've had people message me and say, like, you should join a clinic, or you should just do, or people message me, like, one person's messaged me directly who represents a clinic and says, hey, you could access here. And I refuse, because quite honestly, it's like, I refuse. That essentially what's happened is it's like, right, we'll be able to allow you, because obviously I don't know, I'm fortunate enough also to not have a medical issue which requires it. And I think that's where I kind of feel like I refuse to pretend, lie, or deceive in
yeah,
order to get something which it should be a fucking human right to be able to access
yeah,
this
you've got
thing
to like crawl on your fucking hands and knees to
for
get something
them.
which
It's like,
is
fuck you, man. And that's what it's like.
yeah.
And also the prices, it seems to be very consistent. So it's just lower than street price. Just lower. That's just enough, and it's just,
Yeah.
and that's why I did a couch skit, an animation, and that's what's called UK Medical Cannabis. And that's what I said that for Cannaman at the end was just that it just seems to be convenient that it's always just below the fucking price, and I don't know, there just seems to be a network of it. And I think that's where I stand now with it, where it's like, it's not acceptable that for something it should be a human right, that you have to go through this process, this network of medical narrative in order to access something because you enjoy it, and that's the main thing. They're refusing like the therapeutic basis behind their enjoyment.
It's
That's
a it's a real it's a very unfortunately that yeah the uh drug prohibition has created a very dangerous crack in the structure of free societies
Mhm.
because it's this inflammatory, controversial topic. It's been really difficult for democracies to democratically find their way back to a genuinely free situation where it's up to you as an individual whether you choose to use these things or not,
Mhm.
because of the in the UK, like I say, if you were to have a private, anonymous, personal vote amongst members of the House of Commons and the House of Lords as to whether or not it should be criminalized, whether recreational use of cannabis should be criminalized or not, I'm sure you'd get an overwhelming majority would say that it should not be,
Mhm.
as a matter of principle, particularly in the Conservative Party, even with the more headbanger further right element, actually, you'd find probably more of them would say it shouldn't be because of the sort of libertarian philosophy that a lot of them sort of say they subscribe to. They'd like to kind of performatively posture about how libertarian they are on a topic like that.
Mhm.
When if you get them onto other things, they're very authoritarian. But and in the House of Lords, the fucking social elite, aristocratic, and luminaries and all that who get into there, or cronies of Boris Johnson, I
Mhm.
think you'd find practically 100% of them would say that it shouldn't be criminalized. The problem is that when you get what they're all terrified of the right wing tabloids who dominate still, even as people cease to read newspapers, and still dominate the discourse around these things.
Mhm.
And it's not a grand conspiracy in that sense, that there's a genuine fear in that sense of even going near the topic. But in terms of what you were describing, yeah, it's fucking it's the classic Tories, you know. So all of this happened. That the Horta Farm stuff that I'm describing is a long way back. I think back into the sort of John Major pre-Blair era, the beginnings of that, if I remember correctly. But what you described is post Gordon Brown and David Cameron era, when they actually implemented the process and through Theresa May. And that's just classic plutocratic crony capitalism, you know. It's a vast fucking market that they're plugged into. They don't have to go near it as a domestic issue because they've cordoned it all off with this medicalization bullshit. So as a domestic issue, it's not something they have to really worry about. They've neutralized that, right? They're not going near that, but it's the export market. We're exporting more than any other country in the fucking world.
Yeah.
We've got the largest legal market in that sense for medicinal and scientific cannabis. And ironically, we're also one of the biggest opiate producers as well.
Of course.
Yeah. It's classic. We've gone right back to the Victorian era when we were also the kings of the narco trade, you know.
Right.
Back then it was narco colonialism, you know. We were because we colonized India, the British that is, and colonized India, and that was the largest market for cannabis drugs and also for opiate drugs as well. And you know, it's actually just funny, you know, like the disparity, the contradiction between the sort of image of the stuffy, conservative British, pasty Northerners and the actual reality that we're like up to our ass in as a nation in the classic narcotics.
The thing is, it wouldn't have as much of a fucking entertainment ring if you were watching Netflix and it was like, "Hi there, Jeeves, we have some fucking coke here." You know what I mean? It's just the
like
same.
smack.
Exactly. Like, fuck, man. But no, I mean, Angus, this has been fucking dynamite, man. But we're gonna have to wrap it up, unfortunately.
Yeah. No,
You got anything you want to
yeah.
fucking throw in, or what you've been focusing on recently, or coming in the future of that before we go?
No, I'm the same as you. I'm pretty knackered today and not too lucid. But no, yeah, thanks, man. It's been good talking as always. I've really enjoyed it, and hopefully we'll get to meet up again next time I'm up in Scotland.
Excellent. Are you coming back up for the fringe again?
Yeah, I hope so. I need to talk to the old folks because they're the main drivers behind that doing that. But we'll see what happens. But yeah, I hope so. I'll let you know when I know for sure. Yeah.
Excellent, excellent, man. Well, let's see, man. This has been fucking awesome. And fucking, man, have a fucking great day.
Yeah, you too, man.
Thanks to Angus for giving me his time, and thanks to you for sticking around until the end of the video. I sincerely hope you enjoyed the content. I'll see you next time.